Welcome to the Author Blurb podcast. I'm your host, Eric Maynard. So today I'm speaking with Frank Zafiro, and it was a great conversation. I've actually asked him to come back on again just because we barely touched what he is basically all about. All of his books. He's a prolific writer. Lots there, lots to talk about, and very enjoyable to talk with. So I hope you enjoy the show. Now, as you're watching this, you're going to start noticing that there's difference in the background, difference in the layouts as the show progresses. I'm constantly trying to improve what I can to make this video and audio better for the people that are watching or listening. I've changed my format of how I'm recording, so it's going to be giving me a different appearance for those who are watching. The audio, you should not notice any difference. I'm still using the same software and everything to make it sound just as I can for you. So I hope it doesn't affect you. I hope you still enjoy the show and enjoy the conversations. With that said, thank you for being here. Watch the show, and I'll be talking with you soon. I'm here with Frank Zafiro, and we're here to talk about the extensive amount of books that he has. I mean, 11 series, over 35 books, and he also writes about his passion of hockey as Frank Solis. I mean, just when it comes to being prolific in writing, Frank is the man and he does it on crime fiction, thriller. Is it a thriller or a mystery? How about this? Instead of me going on and telling everyone about you, Frank, how about you tell everyone exactly who you are and a bit about your books?
Well, I thought you were doing a great job, Eric. And thanks for having me on the show. You hit on the big points. I was a police officer for 20 years in Spokane, Washington, which is on the eastern half of the state, the drier half of the state of Washington. And I started writing stories in the crime fiction genre about 10 years after I came on the job. I'd always been a writer even as a kid, but I didn't start writing any crime fiction until about 2004 or so. And I came on the job in 1993. And most of what I've written has been crime fiction. And kind of the fun part about it is that I haven't just stayed in the one subgenre that people would probably expect, which is the police procedural. I certainly have played pretty heavily in that sandbox, but I've also written hard-boiled series from the criminal standpoint. I have a series about a couple of assassins and the private investigator series, a couple of those as well. And so really the only major subgenre that I haven't dabbled in has been cozies, and that's just not really in my wheelhouse. So not to disparage cozies at all. One of my very best friends writes a cozy series. But you know what you can do and you know what you can't do.
Trust me, I understand that very much. Just like my ability of romance is the right romance is just miles away from my grasp. And I've tried fantasy and sci-fi, and that came out to be complete junk. So I stick with the crime side of thrillers is what I stick to. And yeah, you stick with what you know and what you're good at and what you enjoy. So let me ask this. Let's start with the procedural series. With those there, like you said, you were an officer for 20 years. I believe I read you retired as a captain in the force. How much of that do you bring in? Because I've listened to your podcasts, and I believe it's Wrong Crime, Right Time. Am I saying that right?
Close. Wrong place, or right crime.
Oh, okay.
Right crime with a typewriter,
Yeah. So, hey, it's been a busy day, so I do apologize. I actually listened to the episode that came out today, so I enjoyed it.
Oh, with Emily Duncan?
Yes. So for anyone that's listening, this show is pre-recorded, just like most of them are. So, but yeah, I even heard you say on there that cozies is not your forte as well. But
Well, and for that reason, I admire people who can pull it off and do a good job of it. And Emmeline Duncan, which is a pen name for Kelly Garrett, she's got a wonderful premise there of a uh, cozy series taking place around a coffee truck, a food truck in Portland, Oregon. So I think cozies are cool. I don't know that I could write them. Police
right,
procedurals, on the other hand, I mean, I lived that. So the right what you know maxim kind of comes to bear.
right. And one thing I've heard is I've heard authors that's written the procedurals talk about how they've talked to different cops and different people in the industry and all this stuff. You have firsthand knowledge of it. How often do you read a book or something like that and you realize it's not factual of what they call themselves procedurals, but it just seems they're making it up as they go? Because I imagine you're bringing actual experience into your books, and I heard you said that that does get frustrating to you.
It can, so just any expert in a field, when they see their field portrayed in film or TV or in books, it's pretty easy to nitpick. I mean, and it's no real fault of the authors because often they're portraying a stereotype or a trope that they've seen elsewhere pretty commonly, and just because it's not accurate, doesn't probably won't, it'll probably get past the reader. That most readers might not pick up on it as well. But there is a certain level of authenticity that comes with law enforcement professionals, whether they were, officers or if they worked in a civilian role as a dispatcher or something along those lines, writing procedurals, much like a lawyer writing a law book or somebody who is in the medical profession writing a medical thriller. You just bring authenticity to it by default.
Right.
Um, and you don't have to do as much research because, the elements are already there. And so I've written two procedural series, one by myself and one co-authored. And that's a nice element to both, is that they are authentic, um, and I didn't have to work too hard for that authenticity. And that's just, I mean, you gotta play to your strengths and your advantages in this world, and so
Right.
that was certainly one that I was able to bring to the table.
So do you think with that, the some days there's, well, most days for me anymore, there's just certain words you can't say at certain times. Do you think bringing your life experience into it brings out more of the life in the book, bringing the characters and everything? Because just what to do for your storyline in compared to the others that you read.
I think every book, any mystery or whatever, has to be a good story with good characters to start with, obviously. And so I could write the most technically accurate police procedural in the world, and it could completely suck because if the characters aren't good, if the story isn't compelling, and of course, if it isn't executed well, it's not going to matter. And so, but on the flip side of that, if you do have compelling characters and you do have a good story to tell, and you're able to execute it at least marginally well, then that extra layer of authenticity that you get having lived it and being able to bring small details in or nuances of existing details, how people talk on the radio or the order in which they do certain mundane tasks, that's not going to make or break a book, but it might tip a book from being a decent book to a good book or a good book to a great book. And I do think that people who have done this job, like any job, when you're writing about it, I think they bring that into the equation.
All right. So you said that you've written out of the 11, I think it is, I counted, out of the 11 series, you did only two in procedurals. What is the other ones in, and which one would you like to start discussing first off of those?
Well, the two procedurals are the River City series, which is an ensemble cast of officers, although the core character is probably Katie McLeod. And that began in 1994, setting wise, and it's up to, well, the eighth one will be out this summer, and that is set in 2008. So I'm trying to catch it up to current day. And that's one where I tried to really show the humanity of the officers, because I long felt, particularly while I was on the job, that people don't necessarily see a person when they look at a cop. They tend to see the badge or the gun or the uniform or the symbol or whatever. And sometimes, of course, we don't do ourselves any favors when it comes to, propagating that and keeping that going. But nonetheless, I worked with so many wonderful people who were dedicated, talented, hardworking, and who were really there because it was a calling. And I wanted to portray that, but in a way that wasn't hero worship. I mean, cops are like anyone else; they have their flaws, and so I wanted to show those as well. But I would say, on balance, the River City series is a very favorable view of the police and the procedural series. The other one, the Charlie 316 series, actually originated with my friend Colin Conway, who was an officer for about 5 years. We met while we were both on the job, and he came to me with this idea of an officer involved shooting that happens, and the shooter being a golden child of the department, and a ton of different politics coming to bear and how that would play out. And he wanted to write it together because I had experience in the upper echelons of police politics, and he had different experiences while on the job, and he didn't want to get over his skis, but he had a very compelling story already. And so we started working on it, and of course it took off from there. And one book actually became a 4-book arc, and now the 5th book, which is kind of a standalone but in the same universe, just came out here in May, the ride along, and that was a completely different experience. But in that one, I would say it's a little bit more balanced view. The cops are the heroes, but they're not always painted in the most favorable light. It's more balanced in regard. So those are the procedural series. I wrote a couple of private investigator series, and the first of which is a spinoff from my River City series. So in the River City series, there's an officer named Stefan Kopriva, who's a young hotshot in the first book. He's about a 3-year officer, and for anyone who has ever been on the job, that at that 3-year stage ish, it's a very dangerous time, because you've reached a level of proficiency where you are pretty good at your job and you do know a lot. But it's almost like when you're a teenager. You think you know more than you know, and you think you can do more than you can do, and there's a cockiness that comes along with it.
Right.
And so that year 3 and year 4, I mean, I'm speaking generally, of course, but for a lot of cops, it's a very interesting period. Usually around the 5-year mark, you kind of hit adulthood, if you will, and you start to realize. I look back at my 3-year self and I cringe. 3 years on, and so anyway, Kopriva is a hot shot, and I'm getting into some spoiler territory here, so I'll just say that things occur that result in him leaving the department in less than favorable circumstances, and it's something that bothers him. And so that series starts about 10 years after that event in the River City series, and he's basically an unlicensed private investigator, and kind of down on his luck as well. So there's 3 books in that series. The 4th one will be out this year. The other private investigator series is complete other end of the spectrum. It's a retired officer who had kind of a mediocre career. His name's Jack McCrae, and he goes by Mac. And he worked property crimes as a detective, which isn't glamorous. It's kind of the steady Eddie sort of detective job. It's what I did as a detective for the most part. The only time I did any kind of major crimes work was when it spilled over, from major crimes. And Mac is he retires at 57, I think, and he's got no mark on the world, no parents, no siblings, never married. And he's kind of facing this existential crisis of, was I even here? And so, there's two books in that series now. The second one's coming out in June, and both of them have to do with obviously a mystery that he ends up working on again as an unlicensed PI, but also kind of him facing those existential elements. And so I've never been a private investigator, but I don't imagine it's wildly different than being an investigator while on the job, just different considerations and different resources.
Understand. And then I'm trying to go through the list. And then you also have Sandy Banks Thrillers as well, which is a 2-book series.
That's a that's a will be a 3-book series.
All right.
Pardon me. Will be a 3-book series. The second one will be out late this year. That was an interesting one. I'll tell you the backstory for that. It's a short story. I was working graveyard patrol, and I think I was a lieutenant at the time, and I was walking through where the sergeant's offices are there for right next to the patrol grave roll call room there. And I ran into a guy who was a sergeant at the time. Steve Roll was his name. And we were pretty decent friends. I considered him a good friend. And he was shaking his head and he was just frustrated. And I was like, Steve, what's up? And he's like, I just got a call, on my voicemail from prosecutor. And long story short, they had let a guy go that they had caught as a child molester, and there were some technicalities, and they basically he didn't do any time, or he got a very small sentence or some very dissatisfying result. I don't even remember what it was at the moment, but I remember with Steve was so frustrated. And in a burst of frustration, he said, I'll tell you what, when I retire, I'm going to get, my buddy Brent and you and a bunch of other guys, and we're just going to go around and find these guys that slip through the cracks, these obviously guilty guys, and just beat the hell out of them so they get a little justice. And we kind of laughed because obviously we would never do that. Right. But it's a frustration everybody feels, cops and civilians, when you see somebody obviously guilty get away with something. But it planted a seed, and I thought, what if there was actually a group, like a secret group of vigilantes that did that were fed cases by somebody on the police department of uber guilty scum who got away with it, and they went out and settled that account. And so that's where the idea for the Last Horseman was born, because this group was known as the Four Horsemen. And when the book starts, there's only 2 of them left, and one of them decides he's out. That leaves Sandy as the last horseman. Everything starts crumbling, and it's a pretty action-filled series of events from there. But that was just born out of a very real frustration that people in the profession and outside the profession surely feel.
Oh, I'd imagine that. And yeah, I mean, that sounds like something to be interesting because, like you said, everyone has that whole, these people got off, they shouldn't have got off. Like you said, the child molester, I don't know too many people that would say a child molester should get off for anything other than if he's being, well, I'm not going to go in there because I have my own personal opinions. And the things I believe should happen to those people would not be appropriate to speak about here. So with that being said, that makes a lot of sense and sounds like an interesting story. I might even have to get into that series myself to read a bit about it. So what actually got you into writing? I mean, I've known plenty of people that started writing, was like, okay, I've written a couple chapters or I've written a novella, I'm good. You went out with, like I said at the beginning of the show, over 35 books. That's not just a interest in writing, that is a obsession, I would almost say.
That's not a bad way to put it. I think I've always considered myself a writer. It's how I always identified myself since I was maybe 10 years old or so. I was always a voracious reader, as most writers are. I grew up on fantasy and science fiction. I was pretty thrilled when I was about 13, 14 years old when I wrote a fan letter to Piers Anthony, the science fiction and fantasy author. And unlike a couple other authors who I think I got a letter back from their secretary, I got a real letter back from Piers Anthony on a couple of different occasions. This would have been in the late 80s, early 80s rather. And it was just on a 3x5 card turned into a postcard with the address on one side and a typed message on the whole back of the other side with strikeouts and misspellings. And it was obviously cranked it out pretty quick, but it was very personalized. It was like, and that told me, you matter as a reader to me, the writer, and that really stuck with me. And so I always wanted to write. I worked on it, throughout my teenage years and my 20s. But you don't just say, "Hey, I'm a writer." Somebody starts sending me checks. I mean, there's a journey there, and
Right.
and of course that journey, in my case, took me into the military and then into the police department. And while I did a lot of writing along the way, I did have about a 8-year hiatus from fiction while I was going back to school full time and learning new positions in the police department every couple of years. But even then, I was writing a lot. I mean, when you get a degree in history, you write a ton of papers, and of course, the law enforcement profession has a lot of writing in it. That people might not think of it that way, but there is. And so, for me, it was like I equated to somebody who just knows they're a musician, and they pick up a guitar when they're 6, and they've never thought of themselves in any different way, really. Um, I mean, I know it sounds a little pretentious, but that's just, always how I felt. And so for me, when I had a chance to breathe a little bit, kind of like Maslow's hierarchy, right? Those base needs have to be met first, but once there's a roof over the head and a paycheck coming in and so forth, that's always what I turned back to, was telling stories.
I understand, and that's a wonderful thing. And like from what I've heard and read on the reviews that you've had in the different books, it seems like you've done a really good job at entertaining people. So help me on, or let's do this. How about you help me explain to people what books would fit what kind of people, who would be interested in your books? I guess this is the best way to say it. This is your pitch to the readers of who should be reading what.
Well, I mean, obviously, if you like police procedurals that are realistic, that probably lean towards favorable, where the police are concerned, but not just beating the cops or perfect drama at the same time. You want human cops. The River City series certainly is there for that, and the Charlie 316 series that I talked about previously. The nice part about the River City series for me is that because it's taking place over so much time, these characters learn and grow and change. Some die and some retire and others promote and so forth. And so if you start at the beginning and you keep reading through, you're on a journey with these characters and you get to have some of the emotional ups and downs that they go through, particularly, like I said, Katie McLeod, who is the emotional core of the series after probably starts about the second book and is still the case in the 8th book. And so, that's what you would want if you're into the police procedurals. If you're into the PI books, I mentioned those already. If you like more of the hard-boiled, maybe from the criminal perspective, then my Spell Compton series would be for you. That's
Would that be the assassin? Would that be the assassin series you talked about?
No, that's a different one. The Spell Compton series starts with At Their Own Game. And it's totally from the other side of the badge. I mean, my tagline is that I write gritty crime fiction from both sides of the badge, and this is the underside of the badge, if you will. All 3 of the books so far, and I'm working on the 4th one now, and it's also true. Are come from the perspective of the criminals, and so if you like that underbelly, edgy, sort of hard-boiled crime novel, then that's definitely the one that you'd want to pick up. The Assassin one you mentioned is a series I wrote with Eric Beetner called the Bricks and Cam Jobs series. The first one is called The Backlist, and that was really cool because it's about a couple of different characters. I wrote one, Paula Bricky, aka Bricks, and Eric wrote the other, Cameron, and they're both buttonmen for the mafia, but the mafia is downsizing. Times are tough, and so as part of their downsizing efforts, they decide they're not going to keep their staff, if you will. So they give each of these hitmen, neither of which knows the other, a list of outstanding accounts, a backlist, if you will, three names, and how they acquit themselves will go a long way towards determining which one of them has a job and which one of them's out of a job. Of course, it's not that easy, and it's not that simple, and things go awry. And it's I would say the Brick and Cam Jobs are part action, part dark humor. Um, and Eric and I tried to mix the two in equal parts. My humor contribution in the case of Bricks is probably more sarcasm. From her, she's pretty quick-witted and pretty sharp-tongued. Cameron's more situational humor, as how Eric wrote it. So it was pretty fun to write, and Eric Beetner is a fantastic author. If you like fast moving crime fiction, definitely check out his work. And I had a great time writing that series with him. We wrap it up in the third book. It is really basically a trilogy. I don't know that there'll be any more in that series, so it's a pretty quick 3-book read for people who like that kind of thing. If you're more into the noirish, hard-boiled, I wrote a series with Jim Brickey called the Anya series. There's 4 books in that, 3 books, and then the 4th is actually a prequel. The first one we wrote was Blood on Blood. And this is an interesting series because it started out as a single book, and then a minor character that Jim introduced into a chapter ended up blowing up and becoming kind of the through thread that ended up being the thread that all 4 books were connected by. But we wrote this book, much like the book I wrote with Eric, with 2 protagonists, and I wrote one and he wrote the other. We wrote both in the first person with alternating chapters. And so in Blood on Blood, you get a Mick chapter, and then you get a Jersey chapter, and then it goes back and forth. And this character Vanya that Jim introduced, this classic femme fatale siren, she ends up being the one. She's the only one that's in all 4 books. And in the second book, we moved to Vegas with 2 different protagonists, and then Northern California with 2 more in the final book in the series, and then the prequel brings it back to Florida with two different protagonists in it. But Anya's in all of them, and it's a pretty dark, very noir, very very hard boiled sort of series, and it's a lot of fun. Jim and I argue about the best order to read them in. He contends that you should read Harbinger, the prequel, first, and then read the series. I vehemently disagree. I think the twists and turns of the prequel have a lot more impact if you've read the first 3 books first, and then read the prequel, which is an origin story. We disagree on that. And the thing is we're both right. It's just a different experience, whichever way you decide to go.
Understand. So with that being said, I don't want to hold you up for too long. So I'm going to thank you for being here. I do appreciate you being on. People's going to want to find you other than just listening to you here. Where do you suggest people go find you? I have a profile of you set up on authorblurb.com with the links you've given me. They can also find the podcast on your homepage or your webpage if they want to listen to more of your conversations there. But where do you suggest people find you?
I do think the easiest place is my website, frankzafiro.com. It's also helpful whatever platform you use, if you're on Amazon, if you utilize BookBub or Goodreads, to follow me on those platforms, Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. Pretty easy to find on all those locations. I also have a newsletter that I keep people up to date on new events, and sometimes ask the newsletter subscribers for a little bit of help when it comes to picking a cover or other developmental things that pop up occasionally. But mostly it's a way just to kind of keep in touch with readers and let them know something new's coming out. I have a pretty full release calendar this year, so any of those locations you'd be able to pick up the information when a new book is coming.
Well, that sounds good. And like I said, I do appreciate you being here. I've enjoyed our conversation. What I'm going to do is I'm going to end the recording, so that's the end of the conversation everyone else is going to hear us talk about. But if you can hold on, you and I could talk a little bit more afterwards.
All right, I could do that. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. So that was my conversation with Frank. Like I said, I hope you enjoy it. I hope you had fun in it as much as I did. Frank also goes by Frank Scalia, as you might have heard, who writes about hockey. So Frank is a very interesting man. I hope you go find his books, purchase them, go to his website, learn more about him. So with that being said, if you feel inclined, I hope you go to authorblurb.com, where you can find more information about Frank on the website under the profile for the guest list that I have there. In that guest list, you can find the past guests, also upcoming guests. You can sort by the genre, if they're fiction, published, self-published, however you want to do it. I try to give you as many options as I can. There you can also find the podcast that's already been aired, and you can find links to where you can go to your favorite viewer to see them. Or you can also go and find them on Rumble or YouTube. I try to be as many places as I can so you can enjoy the show as much as you can. While you're at the website, there's also a link there for showing support. Support can come in many ways: giving me a 5-star rating, giving me a thumbs up on the video, telling people that you like the show. You can also do what's called buy a cup of coffee, where you give a few dollars, nothing more, and it's well appreciated. You can donate in crypto, or right now I also have a link to my author page where you can go and purchase my books. That will also help me too, and you get something out of it. I'm working on setting up a Patreon page as well, so I can offer you more stuff to make you happy. Like I always try to say, it's all about you, the readers, connecting with the authors and making it a wonderful show. So thank you, and I hope you have a good day.